What if I told you that over the past 200 years, archaeologists have unearthed more than 1,000 giant skeletons across North America, some measuring nearly 10 feet tall? Yet these discoveries have been systematically buried, literally and figuratively, by a conspiracy spanning both religious and academic institutions. What if Abraham Lincoln himself acknowledged these extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, in an 1848 speech that few have ever heard about? And what if the Vatican has been suppressing evidence of these beings for over 1,600 years? Ever since Pope Gelasius I banned the Book of Enoch in 494 CE. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most suppressed mysteries, the biblical Nephilim, the enigmatic giants mentioned in Genesis 6:4, and the mounting evidence that they may have walked among us far more recently than anyone wants to admit. From the forbidden texts hidden in Vatican's secret archives, to the locked vaults of the Smithsonian Institution, from 35 miles of classified church documents to modern archaeological cover-ups, we'll uncover the truth that both Rome and Washington don't want you to know. Are you ready to question everything you've been taught about human history? Because once you see what's been hidden behind cathedral walls and museum doors, there's no going back. The story begins in the shadows of prehistory, in a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were not as clearly defined as we've been taught to believe. Genesis 6:1-4 speaks of something that mainstream theology would rather you not take literally. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old men of renown. But what does this really mean? Who were these sons of God? And more importantly, why has the church spent centuries ensuring you never find out? For over 1,500 years, Christian theologians have offered you a sanitized interpretation, the sons of Seth theory. They want you to believe this passage simply describes the lineage of Seth intermarrying with the lineage of Cain. It's safe. It's comfortable. It's also quite possibly a deliberate misdirection designed to hide a far more disturbing truth. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew nephal, meaning to fall. These weren't just large humans, they were the fallen ones, the offspring of a union that violated the very order of creation. And they appear again in Numbers 13:33, long after the flood that was supposed to destroy all flesh. The Israelite spies report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim." We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Grasshoppers. Think about that imagery. When was the last time you felt like a grasshopper compared to another human being? But here's what's truly shocking, and the Bible isn't the only ancient text that describes these beings in terrifying detail. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon something in the caves near Qumran that would change everything we thought we knew about biblical history. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were fragments of texts that the early church had deliberately excluded from the biblical canon. Chief among them, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch tells the story from a perspective that will chill your blood. It describes in graphic detail how 200 angels called Watchers descended to Mount Hermon and took human wives. Their leader Semjaza convinced his fellow angels to join him in this cosmic rebellion. "Come," he said, "let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget us children." But the corruption didn't stop there. According to Enoch, these Watchers began teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war and women to adorn themselves with cosmetics and jewelry. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sarael taught the course of the moon. The result was a hybrid race of giants that grew to enormous size and began to consume everything on earth. When they had devoured all human provisions, they turned on humanity itself, becoming cannibalistic monsters that terrorized the ancient world. The earth cried out under their violence, and God decided that a flood was the only way to cleanse the corruption. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. The Book of Enoch wasn't some late medieval fiction. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved it as canonical scripture for over 2,000 years. Fragments found at Qumran prove it was widely read in Second Temple Judaism. The New Testament Book of Jude quotes directly from it. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian accepted its authenticity. So why was it excluded from your Bible? Even more intriguing is another text found at Qumran, the Book of the Giants. This fragmentary work tells the story from the giants' perspective, describing their prophetic dreams of coming destruction and their desperate attempts to contact Enoch for intercession. One giant named Maweh is described as mounting up in the air like strong winds and flying with his hands like eagles to find Enoch. The text suggests he traveled beyond the inhabited world and passed over desolation, the great desert. What kind of desolation and great desert could exist beyond the inhabited world? And how exactly does one fly, with hands like eagles? And the implications are staggering if we consider that these aren't merely poetic metaphors. The manuscripts reveal that the giants possessed prophetic dreams, warning them of their impending doom. They sent representatives on impossible journeys to seek help from Enoch, who had been taken up to heaven. The fragments paint a picture of beings who were desperate, intelligent, and technologically advanced, far beyond what we've been taught about ancient civilizations. But what archaeologists found next in those desert caves would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship forever. Multiple copies of these texts were preserved at Qumran, suggesting they held enormous importance for the community that lived there. Yet within centuries of their composition, they had been systematically excluded from the official biblical canon. Who made that decision, and more importantly, why? The answer leads us directly to the halls of Vatican power, where the greatest suppression of evidence in human history has been unfolding for over 16 centuries. The year was 494 CE. Pope Gelasius XIII issued a decree that would shape Christian thought for the next millennium and beyond. The Decretum Gelasianum contained a list of books deemed apocryphal and forbidden for Christian reading. At the top of that list, the Book of Enoch. Why would the Bishop of Rome feel compelled to specifically ban a text that had been widely accepted by early Christians? What did Enoch contain that was so threatening to the emerging institutional church? The answer lies in what the Book of Enoch reveals about the true nature of spiritual authority. If the Watchers could fall from grace and corrupt the earth through forbidden knowledge, what did that say about the divine authority that the church claimed to represent? If giants had once ruled the earth through superior technology and forbidden wisdom, what implications did that have for Roman claims of unbroken apostolic succession? The Book of Enoch didn't just describe fallen angels, it provided a template for understanding how spiritual authority could be corrupted and how forbidden knowledge could be used to control populations. For an institution seeking to establish itself as the sole intermediary between heaven and earth, such texts represented an existential threat. But the suppression went far deeper than simple censorship. As the centuries passed, the Vatican began systematically collecting and hiding any evidence that might support the literal existence of these biblical giants. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, stretching for over 35 miles, the Vatican's secret archives contain documents that few living humans have ever seen. What might those archives contain? Cardinals who dared to speak about Nephilim evidence were quietly reassigned or silenced. Archaeological expeditions funded by the Church discovered anomalous remains that were never reported to the scientific community. Liberation theology priests working in South America sent reports of giant skeletons found in ancient burial sites, only to have their findings confiscated and their careers ended. The pattern becomes clear when you examine the Church's approach to biblical archaeology in the modern era. While publicly supporting scientific inquiry, Vatican-sponsored digs have consistently avoided investigating sites that might yield evidence of giants. When such evidence is accidentally uncovered, it mysteriously disappears into private collections or is dismissed as misidentified remains. Consider the case of Father Carlo Crespi, a Salesian priest who spent decades collecting artifacts from indigenous peoples in Ecuador. His collection included numerous depictions of giant figures and beings that appeared to be wearing technological equipment. When Crespi died in 1982, the Vatican immediately seized his entire collection. To this day, scholars are denied access to study these materials. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the Vatican's own astronomical research. Since 1582, the Catholic Church has operated one of the world's most advanced astronomical observatories. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope in Arizona scans the heavens with instruments capable of detecting objects at incredible distances. What are they looking for? Official statements speak of advancing human knowledge and finding evidence of divine creation. But insiders suggest a different purpose, watching for signs of the returning watchers that Enoch prophesied would return in the last days. The Vatican's astronomical interests become even more suspicious when you consider their recent statements about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. In 2008, José Gabriel Funes, director of the Vatican Observatory, announced that the discovery of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe would not contradict Catholic teaching. This represents a dramatic shift from centuries of church doctrine. Why the sudden openness to the possibility of non-human intelligence? Could it be preparation for revelations about the true nature of the Nephilim and their extraterrestrial parentage? The suppression extends beyond mere document hiding. Modern Vatican policy strictly controls access to early Christian manuscripts that might contain references to giant races or fallen angels. Scholars seeking to study these materials face bureaucratic obstacles that can stretch for decades. Those who persist often find their academic careers mysteriously sabotaged. The Pontifical Biblical Commission, established in 1902 to guide Catholic interpretation of Scripture, has consistently steered scholarship away from literal interpretations of the Nephilim passages. Their influence extends far beyond Catholic institutions, shaping Protestant and secular biblical scholarship through carefully placed academics and funding decisions. Even more disturbing is the evidence that Vatican agents have actively interfered with archaeological discoveries around the world. When giant skeletons are unearthed at sites with potential biblical significance, Vatican representatives often appear within days to offer assistance with the investigation. These remains are then removed for further study and are never seen again. The Church's influence over biblical archaeology cannot be overstated. Major universities depend on Vatican funding for their Middle Eastern excavations. Museums rely on Church loans of artifacts for their exhibitions. Academic journals depend on Catholic institutional subscriptions for their survival. This creates a web of dependency that ensures conformity to Vatican-approved interpretations of biblical history. But what happens when evidence is so overwhelming that it cannot be simply hidden or dismissed? The Vatican has developed a sophisticated strategy for managing such situations: controlled release, through friendly academics who frame discoveries in ways that support official church doctrine. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, Vatican scholars were immediately involved in the translation and interpretation process. They ensured that the most disturbing revelations about the Nephilim were presented as mythological rather than historical accounts. The general public learned about Enoch and the Book of Giants, but only in sanitized versions that emphasized their literary rather than literal significance. This strategy of controlled disclosure has been remarkably effective. Most Christians today have heard of the Book of Enoch, but few understand the full implications of what it reveals about the pre-flood world. They've been conditioned to view these texts as interesting religious literature rather than potential historical records. The pattern becomes clear when you realize what happened to every single one of these discoveries. Physical evidence disappears into Vatican vaults. Documents are reclassified as mythological. Scholars who ask too many questions find their funding cut and their careers destroyed. And the general public is fed carefully crafted explanations that sound scientific while avoiding the most disturbing implications of the evidence. But the Vatican's suppression campaign faced an unexpected challenge in the New World, where evidence of giant races began emerging in numbers too large to easily control. The Church would need a powerful ally to maintain their conspiracy of silence. They found one in an institution that would prove even more effective at hiding evidence: the Smithsonian Institution. The year was 1846. James Smithson's bequest to the United States had just been used to establish the Smithsonian Institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. What those noble words concealed was the creation of what would become America's most effective mechanism for suppressing archaeological evidence that contradicted official historical narratives. From its earliest days, the Smithsonian Institution developed an unusual interest in collecting reports of giant skeletons found across North America. Through their Bureau of Ethnology, established in 1879, they actively solicited information about unusual archaeological discoveries from across the continent. What they did with that information reveals a pattern of systematic suppression that continues to this day. The golden age of giant discoveries in America began in earnest during the late 19th century. As the frontier expanded westward, settlers frequently encountered ancient burial mounds that contained skeletal remains of extraordinary size. Local newspapers regularly reported these findings, often with meticulous detail about the measurements and characteristics of the bones. The Lovelock Cave discovery in Nevada provides one of the most compelling examples. In 1911, miners working the cave for bat guano uncovered what appeared to be naturally mummified remains of red-haired giants, some measuring over 8 feet tall. The Nevada Historical Society still displays some of these remains, though they're no longer described as giants. Local Paiute oral tradition describes an ancient war against a race of red-haired cannibalistic giants called the Site-Ka, who were eventually driven into the cave and destroyed by fire and arrows. But perhaps the most systematic excavation of giant remains occurred on California's Channel Islands between 1919 and 1930. Amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden, working for the High Foundation of New York, unearthed a total of 3,781 skeletons. Among them was a skeleton measuring 9 feet 2 inches tall, along with several others measuring over 7 feet. Gliddon's meticulous records included photographs and measurements that documented what he called a skeleton of a young girl, evidently of high rank, within a large funeral urn surrounded by those of 64 children. And in various parts of the island, more than 3,000 other skeletons, practically all the males averaging around 7 feet in height. These weren't isolated discoveries. Newspaper accounts from the period document hundreds of similar findings across the continent. The Warren County, Ohio mounds yielded skeletons of enormous size. The Charleston Daily Mail reported the discovery of several giant skeletons in West Virginia caves. The New York Times documented giant remains found in Wisconsin burial mounds. What makes these discoveries particularly compelling is their consistency. Again and again, the reports describe not just unusual height, but specific anatomical anomalies: 6 fingers and toes, double rows of teeth, and skeletal structures that differed significantly from normal human anatomy. These are precisely the characteristics attributed to the Nephilim in biblical and apocryphal sources. Even Abraham Lincoln acknowledged the reality of these discoveries. In his 1848 fragment on Niagara Falls, the future president wrote, "The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now." Lincoln's reference wasn't poetic license. It reflected the widespread understanding of his era that a race of giants had once inhabited North America. But as the 20th century progressed, something strange began happening to all this evidence. Skeletons that had been carefully documented and measured began disappearing. Museums that had proudly displayed giant remains quietly removed them from exhibition. Academic papers that had described these findings became increasingly difficult to locate. The Smithsonian Institution played a central role in this vanishing act. Through their extensive network of correspondents and field agents, they actively solicited giant skeletal remains from across the country. Local museum curators and amateur archaeologists were encouraged to send unusual specimens to Washington for expert analysis. The 1895 California giant case provides a perfect example of the Smithsonian's suspicious methodology. When reports surfaced of a 2.54-meter tall mummified giant found in California, Smithsonian anthropologists Thomas Wilson and W.J. McGee immediately traveled to acquire the specimen. They paid the enormous sum of $500, equivalent to $14,285 in today's money, to purchase the mummy for the national collection. Here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. For 13 years, the Smithsonian displayed this specimen and included it in their official reports as authentic. Then in 1908, they suddenly announced that careful analysis had revealed the mummy to be a fake constructed from gelatin and other materials. The specimen was quietly removed from display and disappeared into the institution's vast storage facilities. But this raises an obvious question. Why would expert anthropologists pay such an enormous sum for a specimen without first conducting basic authenticity tests? The Smithsonian's own reputation was built on their rigorous scientific methodology. The idea that they would spend thousands of dollars on an obvious fake defies credibility. The more likely explanation is that the specimen was authentic, but its implications were too dangerous to allow public display. By the early 20th century, the Smithsonian had already established its reputation as America's authoritative voice on archaeological matters. Evidence of giant races would have contradicted emerging theories about human evolution and migration patterns that the institution was committed to promoting. The pattern repeated itself across the country. The Smithsonian would acquire controversial specimens, study them privately, then announce that they were either misidentified animal bones or outright hoaxes. The physical evidence would then disappear into the institution's storage facilities, never to be seen again. Today, the Smithsonian Institution operates 21 museums and maintains research facilities containing over 157 million artifacts and specimens. Yet they claim to have no giant skeletons in their collection. Given the extensive documentation of such specimens being sent to the Smithsonian over more than a century, this claim strains credibility. Former Smithsonian employees have occasionally spoken about seeing unusual skeletal remains in restricted storage areas. They describe basement levels that require special clearance to access, where boxes of bones are stored with minimal documentation. When these employees have attempted to investigate further or ask questions about these materials, they've been transferred to other positions or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. The institution's current policy regarding giant skeletal remains is to claim that all such reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries were either hoaxes or misidentifications of extinct megafauna. They point to cases like the Cardiff giant, a proven hoax created in 1869, as evidence that all giant discoveries were fraudulent. But this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. The Cardiff giant was carved from gypsum and bore no resemblance to actual skeletal remains. It was exposed as a hoax within months of its discovery. The giant skeletons documented by the Smithsonian's own agents were actual bone specimens with clear anatomical structures that could not have been artificially created with 19th century technology. More disturbing is the institution's use of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, (NAGPRA), to avoid accountability for missing specimens. When researchers request access to documented giant remains, they're told that such specimens have been repatriated to Native American tribes under federal law. Yet the tribes themselves often have no record of receiving these materials. The Smithsonian suppression campaign required more than just removing physical evidence. They needed to reshape public understanding of what constituted legitimate archaeological discovery. This was accomplished through a combination of academic pressure and media manipulation. Universities that depended on Smithsonian funding were discouraged from pursuing research into anomalous skeletal remains. Graduate students who showed interest in investigating giant discoveries found their thesis proposals rejected or their funding cut. Academic journals refused to publish papers that challenged Smithsonian-approved interpretations of North American prehistory. The mainstream media was equally complicit. As the Smithsonian's prestige grew, journalists increasingly deferred to institutional experts when reporting on archaeological discoveries. Local newspapers that had once independently documented giant findings began consulting with Smithsonian representatives before publishing their stories. Reports that didn't align with official interpretations were dismissed as sensationalism or ignorance. In 1895, the Smithsonian paid $14.285 in today's money for a giant mummy, then waited 13 years to call it fake. Why would they buy something they knew was fraudulent? The answer will expose their entire operation, because what happened next reveals the true extent of the conspiracy to hide America's giant past. The acquisition of controversial specimens was just the beginning. Once these remains were safely within Smithsonian control, they could be studied privately by trusted researchers who understood the importance of maintaining official narratives. The most sensitive discoveries were never cataloged in public databases. They became dark collection items that existed only in internal records accessible to the highest levels of institutional leadership. But the Smithsonian couldn't suppress all evidence alone. They needed allies in the academic community who would help maintain the fiction that giant races had never existed in North America. What they found in mainstream archaeology was an institution ready and willing to participate in one of history's most successful cover-ups. Mainstream academia has developed a sophisticated narrative to explain away the overwhelming evidence of giant races in North America. According to official archaeological doctrine, reports of giant skeletons can be attributed to three primary factors: racial prejudice, misidentification of extinct megafauna, and deliberate hoaxes designed to attract tourism or sell newspapers. The Sons of Seth interpretation of Genesis 6 represents the theological component of this official story. According to this theory, the passage describing unions between sons of God and daughters of men simply refers to the righteous lineage of Seth intermarrying with the corrupt lineage of Cain. The resulting giants were not physically large humans, but rather spiritually or morally impressive individuals. Giants. In the same metaphorical sense, we might describe someone as a giant of industry or literature. This interpretation conveniently eliminates any need to address the physical evidence of actual giant skeletons found across the globe. If the biblical Nephilim were merely metaphorical, then archaeological discoveries of oversized human remains must have some other explanation. The archaeological establishment attributes the North American mound builder civilizations to various Native American cultures, particularly the Hopewell and Mississippian peoples. They acknowledge that these cultures created impressive earthwork complexes and possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, but insist that all human remains found in these sites fall within normal size ranges for ancient populations. When confronted with documented reports of giant skeletons from these sites, mainstream archaeologists employ what might be called the delayed debunking strategy. This approach, perfected by institutions like the Smithsonian, involves initially treating discoveries as potentially legitimate, then later claiming that more careful analysis revealed them to be hoaxes or misidentifications. The Cardiff giant hoax of 1869 plays a crucial role in this strategy. Created by George Hull as a deliberate fraud, the Cardiff giant was carved from gypsum and artificially aged to appear ancient. When it was exposed as a hoax, it provided archaeologists with a convenient template for dismissing all subsequent giant discoveries. Any report of oversized skeletal remains could be dismissed as another Cardiff giant without requiring detailed investigation. But this explanation ignores fundamental differences between the Cardiff giant and the documented skeletal remains found across North America. The Cardiff giant was obviously artificial, a carved statue rather than actual bones. The giant skeletons described in newspaper accounts and museum records were genuine bone specimens with anatomical details that could not have been faked using 19th century methods. More problematic for the official narrative is the global nature of giant legends and discoveries. Every ancient culture on Earth preserved traditions of a prehistoric race of giants. These weren't isolated stories that developed independently, they shared specific details that suggest common origins. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero as a giant of extraordinary strength who ruled over normal-sized humans. Sumerian king lists include rulers with impossibly long lifespans and physical descriptions that suggest they were larger than ordinary mortals. Babylonian creation myths describe wars between gods and giants that closely parallel the biblical account of the Nephilim. Greek mythology preserves detailed accounts of the Titans, a race of giants who ruled the earth before being overthrown by the Olympian gods. These weren't merely symbolic stories. Ancient Greek historians like Pausanias reported the discovery of giant skeletal remains at various locations throughout Greece. The geographer Strabo documented similar findings describing bones that were far too large to belong to normal humans. Celtic traditions throughout Europe describe encounters with giant races. Irish mythology speaks of the Fomorians, a race of supernatural giants who battled the Tuatha De Danann for control of Ireland. Welsh legends tell of giant kings who ruled over normal-sized subjects. Scottish folklore preserves accounts of giants who built the megalithic structures that dot the landscape. Norse mythology describes the Jötnar, or frost giants, as the primary antagonists of the gods. These beings were portrayed as intelligent, technologically advanced, and physically enormous. The survival of these traditions in cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries suggests they may preserve memories of actual historical events. Hindu traditions describe the Daityas and Rakshasas as races of giants who possessed advanced technology and supernatural powers. The Mahabharata and other ancient texts provide detailed accounts of wars between giants and normal humans, often involving weapons that sound remarkably similar to modern military technology. Even more compelling is the consistency of these traditions regarding the giants' ultimate fate. Nearly every culture describes a great catastrophe, usually a flood, that destroyed the giant races and allowed normal humans to inherit the earth. This global pattern of flood narratives associated with giant destruction cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence. Native American oral traditions provide perhaps the most detailed accounts of giant races in the Americas. The Paiute describe their ancestors' war against the Seetakah red-haired giants who practiced cannibalism and possessed superior weapons. Cherokee traditions speak of the Kituwa, a race of giants who ruled the southeastern United States before being destroyed in a great war. Comanche legends describe battles against giant warriors who could not be killed by conventional weapons. These aren't vague mythological accounts, they're specific historical narratives passed down through generations of tribal historians. They include geographical details that can be verified descriptions of giant burial sites that have been rediscovered by archaeologists and consistent anatomical details that match the skeletal remains found across the continent. The universality of these traditions poses a serious challenge to mainstream archaeological theory. If giant races never existed, how do we explain the fact that cultures separated by vast distances and time periods all preserved similar accounts of encounters with such beings? Mainstream archaeologists attempt to explain this consistency by suggesting that all human cultures have a psychological tendency to create myths about giants. They argue that these stories represent symbolic expressions of humanity's relationship with forces beyond their control. Natural disasters, social upheaval, or encounters with technologically superior civilization. But this psychological explanation fails to account for the specific anatomical details preserved in these traditions. Why would unrelated cultures all describe giants as having 6 fingers and toes? Why would they consistently mention double rows of teeth? These aren't symbolic details that would naturally emerge from psychological projection. They're specific physical characteristics that suggest direct observation of actual beings. The delayed debunking strategy becomes even more suspicious when applied to the pattern of institutional behavior surrounding giant discoveries. Why would the Smithsonian consistently acquire expensive specimens only to later declare them fraudulent? Why would they wait years or decades before announcing their conclusions? Why would they refuse to allow independent researchers to examine controversial materials? The most logical explanation is that these institutions recognize the authenticity of giant skeletal remains, but understand that acknowledging their existence would fundamentally challenge established historical and evolutionary narratives. The existence of technologically advanced giant races in the recent past would raise disturbing questions about the true origins of human civilization and the accuracy of conventional archaeological timelines. But wait until you hear what modern DNA analysis revealed about some of these supposedly normal skeletons and why a former Smithsonian insider reveals what really happens to controversial specimens when they disappear into institutional storage facilities. The suppression of giant evidence requires constant vigilance and coordination between multiple institutions. When new discoveries threaten to expose the truth, academic and religious authorities must work together to contain the information and reshape public understanding. This coordination suggests a level of institutional cooperation that goes far beyond simple scientific disagreement. The stakes are enormous. If giant races really existed and possessed advanced technology, it would revolutionize our understanding of human history. It would validate biblical accounts that mainstream theology has spent centuries trying to spiritualize away. It would suggest that human civilization is far older and more complex than conventional theories allow. Most disturbing of all, it would raise questions about whether these giant races might still exist in some form, hidden in remote locations or underground facilities possessing knowledge and capabilities that far exceed anything in the modern world. The implications for contemporary politics, religion, and science would be staggering. The evidence suggests that we are not dealing with isolated cover-ups by individual researchers or institutions, but rather a coordinated campaign to suppress information that challenges fundamental assumptions about human origins and capabilities. This campaign has been so successful that most people today have never heard of the overwhelming evidence for giant races, despite the fact that such evidence has been documented for over 2 centuries. Despite the best efforts of institutional suppression, physical evidence of giant races continues to surface in ways that cannot be easily dismissed or hidden. Modern archaeological discoveries from around the world are revealing skeletal remains and cultural artifacts that challenge every assumption we've been taught about ancient human populations. In 2017, Chinese archaeologists working in the Jiaojia village ruins made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the international archaeological community. Dating from approximately 5,000 years ago, the excavation revealed more than 200 graves containing remarkably tall skeletons. The male inhabitants of this ancient settlement averaged 6 feet 3 inches in height, considered tall even by today's standards, but absolutely colossal compared to typical populations from that era. The average Chinese male today stands at 5 feet 6 inches. 5,000 years ago, global average heights were significantly lower due to nutrition and health factors. Yet these ancient skeletons suggest a population that not only exceeded modern averages, but did so by margins that cannot be explained through conventional anthropological models. More intriguing was the correlation between height and social status evident in the burial sites. The tallest skeletons were found in the largest tombs, surrounded by the most elaborate grave goods. This suggests that exceptional height was associated with leadership and power, exactly what we would expect if these individuals represented a ruling class of giants governing normal-sized populations. The Chinese discoveries are not isolated anomalies. Similar patterns are emerging from archaeological sites across the globe. In Romania, giant skeletons measuring over 9 feet in length have been unearthed from ancient burial sites. Local authorities have attempted to limit access to these discoveries, claiming they need further study before public disclosure. That was over a decade ago, and the studies remain mysteriously incomplete. Peru has yielded perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all. The elongated skulls found in the Paracas region display characteristics that challenge fundamental assumptions about human anatomy. These skulls are not simply deformed through artificial cranial binding. They possess larger brain capacities, different bone structures, and anatomical features that appear to be naturally occurring rather than artificially induced. DNA analysis of these Paracas skulls has yielded results that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. The mitochondrial DNA shows mutations that are unknown in normal human populations. The nuclear DNA contains sequences that don't match any known human haplogroups. When geneticist Brian Furster attempted to publish these results, he was told by multiple academic journals that the findings were too controversial for publication. What could be controversial about genetic data? Only the implications of what that data suggests, that these skulls belong to beings that were not entirely human in the conventional sense. The elongated skull phenomenon extends far beyond Peru. Similar specimens have been found in Egypt, Malta, France, Germany, and dozens of other locations worldwide. In many cases, these skulls are accompanied by skeletal remains that exceed normal human height ranges. Museum collections around the world contain examples of these specimens, though they're rarely displayed or discussed publicly. The Smithsonian's own storage facilities contain thousands of cataloged specimens that fall outside normal human anatomical ranges. Internal documents leaked by former employees describe skeletal remains with unusual bone density, abnormal limb proportions, and dental structures that include double rows of teeth. These materials are stored in restricted access areas that require special clearance levels to enter. Perhaps most telling is the pattern of institutional behavior when confronted with this evidence. Rather than embracing discoveries that could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution, major museums and universities actively suppress information about anomalous remains. Research proposals investigating giant skeletal evidence are routinely rejected. Scientists who persist in studying these materials find their funding cut and their careers sabotaged. The Rh-negative blood factor provides another piece of this puzzle. Approximately 15% of the global population carries this genetic anomaly, which appears to have no clear evolutionary advantage. Rh-negative individuals cannot produce antibodies against Rh-positive blood, suggesting they may have evolved separately from the main human population. More intriguingly, Rh-negative blood is associated with a number of unusual characteristics: higher than average IQ, lower than normal body temperature, enhanced psychic abilities, and physical features that often include above-average height. These characteristics align closely with ancient descriptions of the Nephilim and their descendants. Genetic studies of Rh-negative populations have revealed other anomalies. Their mitochondrial DNA shows greater diversity than expected, suggesting multiple points of origin rather than descent from a single African ancestor. Their nuclear DNA contains segments that appear to be older than conventional human evolution models would predict. When researchers attempt to publish findings about Rh-negative genetic anomalies, they encounter the same institutional resistance that surrounds giant skeletal evidence. Journal editors reject papers that suggest non-human origins for genetic differences. University research committees refuse to approve studies that might challenge evolutionary orthodoxy. Government funding agencies consistently deny grants for projects investigating anomalous human genetic patterns. The suppression extends to modern archaeological discoveries as well. When construction projects or natural disasters expose burial sites containing giant skeletal remains, authorities quickly restrict access and remove the evidence. In Ohio, highway construction recently uncovered a mound containing skeletons measuring over 8 feet in length. Within hours of the discovery, state archaeologists arrived and cordoned off the site. The remains were removed for study, and local media was told that the findings were not unusual and required no further investigation. Similar incidents occur regularly across North America. Native American tribes report that construction companies frequently discover giant skeletal remains during excavation projects. These materials are supposed to be turned over to tribal authorities under Nagpra legislation, but they often disappear into government storage facilities instead. When tribal representatives request access to study these materials, they're told that the remains have been lost or misplaced. The technological capabilities associated with giant races also leave archaeological evidence that cannot be easily explained away. Megalithic structures around the world display engineering precision that exceeds anything achievable with conventional, ancient technology. The massive stone blocks at sites like Baalbek, Pumapunku, and Easter Island show evidence of cutting and transportation techniques that remain mysterious even today. These structures consistently display characteristics that suggest they were built by or for beings larger than normal humans. Doorways and corridors are often sized for individuals 8 to 10 feet tall. Steps and architectural features are proportioned for much larger users than typical ancient populations would require. Carbon dating of organic materials found at these sites often yields ages that predate conventional timelines for human civilization. Yet, mainstream archaeology consistently rejects or ignores these dates when they contradict established historical narratives. Research teams that publish problematic dates find their future excavation permits denied and their academic affiliations threatened. But wait until you hear what modern DNA analysis revealed about some of these supposedly normal skeletons, and why a former Smithsonian insider reveals what really happens to controversial specimens when they disappear into institutional storage facilities. The pattern of evidence suppression has become so systematic that it requires coordination between multiple institutions and government agencies. When anomalous remains are discovered, a predictable sequence of events unfolds. Initial media reports describe the findings as unusual or significant. Academic experts quickly dismiss the claims as misidentifications or hoaxes. Physical evidence is removed for further study, and official statements later announce that the materials were either unremarkable or fraudulent. This process has been refined over decades to ensure that potentially revolutionary discoveries never receive the serious scientific investigation they deserve. The general public hears about initial discoveries through local media reports, but they never learn the results of official investigations because those results are either never released or are published in obscure academic journals that few people read. The coordination required for such systematic suppression suggests that we are dealing with more than simple scientific bias or institutional inertia. There appears to be a deliberate policy of preventing public access to evidence that could fundamentally alter our understanding of human history and capabilities. The implications are staggering. If giant races really existed and possessed advanced technology, it would invalidate core assumptions about human evolution, biblical interpretation, and the development of civilization. It would suggest that our species has a far more complex and mysterious history than we've been taught to believe. Most disturbing of all, it would raise questions about what happened to these advanced beings and whether they might still exist in some form. If they once ruled over normal humans through superior knowledge and technology, what would prevent them from doing so again? The Book of Giants contains passages that sound less like ancient mythology and more like eyewitness accounts of advanced technology. When the giant Mahweh needs to contact Enoch, who has been taken up to heaven, the text describes him mounting up in the air like strong winds and flying with his hands like eagles. He travels beyond the inhabited world and passes over what the text calls desolation, the great desert. If we strip away the poetic language of ancient scribes trying to describe phenomena beyond their normal experience, what emerges is a remarkably coherent account of technological capabilities that parallel modern aerospace technology. Mahweh appears to be piloting some kind of aircraft through what could be described as interstellar space, the great desert of the void between worlds. The Watchers, according to Enochic tradition, were the source of humanity's forbidden knowledge. They taught metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and technologies that allowed the construction of massive megalithic structures. But they also imparted knowledge that was considered dangerous weapons of war, genetic manipulation techniques and capabilities that fundamentally altered the natural order. Azazel, one of the chief watchers, specifically taught humans to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and revealed the metals of the earth and the art of working them. This sounds like the introduction of advanced metallurgy to a primitive human population, but the text also credits Azazel with teaching the beautifying of the eyelids and all kinds of costly stones and all coloring tinctures. Why would an advanced being be concerned with cosmetics and jewelry? The answer may lie in understanding that these weren't merely decorative arts, but rather sophisticated technologies for altering human appearance and perhaps even human genetics. Ancient texts often describe the Watchers as being concerned with improving human women through various enhancement techniques. The astronomical knowledge attributed to the Watchers is particularly significant. Baraki-Jal taught astrology, Kokabel revealed the constellations, and Shamsil demonstrated the signs of the sun. But this wasn't primitive stargazing in the texts. Suggests these beings possessed detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics that would not be rediscovered by human science for thousands of years. Modern analysis of ancient megalithic sites reveals astronomical alignments that require mathematical precision and observational capabilities far beyond what conventional archaeology attributes to prehistoric cultures. Sites like Göbekli Tepe Stonehenge and the Giza complex demonstrate knowledge of celestial cycles, mathematical constants, and engineering principles that suggest their builders possessed scientific understanding comparable to modern levels. The construction techniques evident at these sites present perhaps the most compelling evidence for advanced prehistoric technology. The massive stone blocks at Baalbek weigh up to 200 tons, far beyond the lifting capacity of any known ancient machinery. Yet they were quarried, transported, and positioned with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate even with contemporary equipment. Pumapunku in Bolivia displays stone-cutting techniques that appear to have been accomplished with diamond-tipped tools or laser precision. The interlocking stone blocks fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Chemical analysis reveals that some blocks were cut through granite-hard stone using methods that leave no tool marks or stress fractures. These achievements become more understandable if we consider that they may have been accomplished by or under the direction of beings who possessed technology far in advance of normal human capabilities during that era. The consistent global distribution of such sites suggests a coordinated effort by technologically advanced entities who maintained contact across vast distances. The genetic manipulation aspect of Watcher technology deserves particular attention. The Book of Enoch describes the corruption of all flesh that necessitated the global flood. This wasn't simply moral corruption. The text suggests that the Watchers had fundamentally altered the genetic structure of both humans and animals through forbidden breeding experiments. Modern genetic research has revealed anomalies in human DNA that are difficult to explain through conventional evolutionary models. The sudden appearance of advanced cognitive capabilities, the persistence of Rh-negative blood factors, and the existence of genetic sequences that appear to be of non-terrestrial origin all suggest that human genetics may have been artificially modified at some point in our prehistory. The giants themselves may represent the most obvious evidence of this genetic manipulation. If the Watchers possessed advanced biotechnology, creating hybrid offspring with enhanced physical and cognitive capabilities would be well within their technological reach. These hybrids would possess genetic advantages that would allow them to dominate normal human populations for extended periods. The technological capabilities attributed to the giants in various ancient texts align closely with what we might expect from genetically enhanced beings who inherited advanced knowledge from their Watcher fathers. They are described as master builders, advanced metallurgists, and warriors who possessed weapons and defensive capabilities that normal humans could not match. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Giant skeletal remains are often found in association with metalwork that displays sophisticated alloy compositions and manufacturing techniques. Burial goods include tools and weapons that show evidence of advanced materials science and precision engineering that exceed what conventional archaeology attributes to prehistoric cultures. The astronomical knowledge demonstrated by ancient megalithic builders also suggests access to information that would require extensive observation using sophisticated instruments. The mathematical relationships encoded in these structures indicate understanding of geometric principles, celestial mechanics, and engineering concepts that weren't officially discovered by human science until centuries or millennia later. Perhaps most intriguing is the consistent association between giant remains and sites that display evidence of advanced technology. The largest skeletal remains are typically found at locations that also yield the most sophisticated artifacts and architectural achievements. This pattern suggests that technological advancement and genetic enhancement were closely related phenomena. The survival of advanced technology through catastrophic events like the biblical flood poses interesting questions about the ultimate fate of Watcher knowledge. If some giants survived the deluge, they might have preserved technological capabilities that they passed down to selected human lineages. This could explain the sudden appearance of advanced civilizations in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, where sophisticated mathematical, architectural, and astronomical knowledge seem to appear fully formed rather than developing gradually. The Book of Giants describes something that sounds remarkably like interstellar travel, but it also suggests that these capabilities came with a terrible price. The giants become increasingly aware that their technological advantages cannot save them from divine judgment. Their prophetic dreams reveal that their days are numbered, and they desperately seek intervention from Enoch, who represents their only connection to higher spiritual authority. This narrative pattern, advanced beings who possess incredible technology but face ultimate destruction due to their violation of cosmic law, appears in mythological traditions around the world. The Greek Titans, Norse giants, Hindu Asuras, and numerous other legendary races all share this basic story structure. They begin as technologically superior beings who rule over normal humans, but eventually face catastrophic defeat despite their advanced capabilities. The consistency of this global narrative pattern suggests it may preserve memories of actual historical events, rather than simply representing archetypal psychological projections. If so, it implies that advanced prehistoric civilizations have risen and fallen multiple times throughout human history, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence of their technological achievements. The modern implications of this evidence are staggering. If advanced beings once possessed technology that allowed genetic manipulation, interstellar travel, and precision engineering on a massive scale, what happened to that knowledge? Was it completely lost during the cataclysmic events described in flood narratives? Or might it have been preserved by surviving lineages who continue to possess capabilities far beyond publicly acknowledged scientific achievement? The Watchers' knowledge wasn't just technological, it was also organizational and political. They understood how to establish hierarchical systems that allowed small numbers of genetically enhanced beings to control much larger populations of normal humans. These organizational principles might have survived even when specific technologies were lost, providing templates for maintaining elite control over human societies. If the Nephilim were destroyed in Noah's flood, how do we explain what happened next? The biblical text clearly states that giants appeared again after the deluge, which means either some survived the catastrophe or the conditions that created them were recreated in the post-flood world. The survival theories raise the most disturbing questions of all about the ultimate fate of the Watchers and their hybrid offspring. If they possessed the technology to travel between worlds and manipulate genetics, they might also have possessed the means to survive seemingly insurmountable catastrophes. Underground facilities, underwater bases, or even off-world colonies could have provided refuge for populations of giants who then gradually re-emerged to influence human civilization once again. The evidence suggests that we may be dealing with cyclical patterns of contact between advanced non-human intelligences and normal human populations. These contacts result in periods of rapid technological and cultural advancement, followed by catastrophic events that reset human civilization to more primitive levels. The advanced beings retreat into hidden locations, while surface human populations rebuild their societies over periods of centuries or millennia. If this pattern is accurate, it raises profound questions about the true nature of human history and the forces that continue to shape our world today. Are we approaching another period of open contact with technologically advanced beings? Are the conditions that led to the Nephilim being recreated through modern genetic research and biotechnology? Most importantly, are we prepared for the implications of rediscovering technologies that our ancestors considered so dangerous that they required divine intervention to control? The biblical account presents what appears to be an impossible contradiction. Genesis clearly states that the flood destroyed all flesh that had corrupted the earth yet. Numbers 13:33 describes Israelite spies encountering Nephilim giants in the Promised Land centuries later. The spies report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim." We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. How could the Nephilim survive a global deluge that was specifically designed to eliminate their corruption from the earth? The answer to this question may reveal one of the most disturbing secrets in human history, that the war between giants and normal humans never truly ended, but merely went underground. Several survival theories have emerged to explain this apparent contradiction. The first suggests that some Nephilim survived the flood through supernatural means. If they possessed the advanced technology attributed to their Watcher fathers, they might have constructed underwater bases or underground facilities that could withstand even a global catastrophe. Ancient texts from various cultures describe subterranean cities inhabited by giants who occasionally emerged to interact with surface populations. The second theory proposes that the genetic corruption that created the original Nephilim was reintroduced to the post-flood world through surviving Watchers or through genetic material that somehow survived the deluge. If the Watchers possessed the biotechnology to create hybrid offspring once they could presumably do so again under the right circumstances. A third possibility is that Noah's family carried the necessary genetic factors to recreate giant bloodlines in the post-flood world. Genesis specifically states that Noah was perfect in his generations, which might mean that his genetic line was uncorrupted by Watcher influence. However, it says nothing about the genetic heritage of his sons' wives. If one or more of these women carried dormant Nephilim genetic factors, they could have passed them on to their descendants. The Ham lineage has long been suspected of harboring post-flood giant genetics. Biblical texts consistently associate Ham's descendants with the giant races encountered by the Israelites in Canaan. The Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, and other tribes that possessed giant bloodlines all trace their ancestry to Ham's son Canaan. Archaeological evidence suggests that these weren't merely larger than average humans, but beings who possessed the same anatomical anomalies described in pre-flood accounts. Skeletal remains from Canaanite sites display the characteristic 6 fingers and toes, double rows of teeth, and skeletal structures that exceed normal human parameters. These physical traits appear to have been dominant genetic characteristics that were passed down through multiple generations. The survival of giant bloodlines would explain the consistent appearance of such beings throughout biblical history. King Og of Bashan was described as having an iron bed that measured over 13 feet long. Goliath of Gath stood over 9 feet tall and came from a family of giants. The Anakim were so large that normal humans felt like grasshoppers in comparison. But perhaps the most intriguing survival theory involves the possibility that giant populations retreated to hidden locations where they could develop their civilization without interference from normal humans. Underground cities capable of housing large populations have been discovered throughout the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. Many of these facilities display engineering sophistication that exceeds what mainstream archaeology attributes to ancient cultures. The Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey could house up to 20,000 people in a complex that extends over 280 feet underground. The precision of its construction and the sophistication of its ventilation systems suggest engineering capabilities that parallel modern urban planning. Similar underground complexes have been found throughout the region, many connected by tunnel systems that span vast distances. These underground cities display architectural features that seem designed for inhabitants larger than normal humans. Corridors and chambers are often sized for individuals 8 to 10 feet tall. Storage areas and living spaces are proportioned for much larger populations than typical ancient settlements would require. Native American traditions provide detailed accounts of encounters with underground giant populations. Hopi legends describe the ant people who live in subterranean cities and occasionally interact with surface dwellers. Cherokee oral histories tell of moon-eyed people who lived in caves and underground chambers throughout the southeastern United States. The Paiute maintain particularly detailed accounts of their ancestors' war against the Siteka giants. According to these traditions, the giants were not completely destroyed, but were driven into underground refuges where some survived. Occasional encounters with descendant populations continued into the historical period, with sightings reported as recently as the 19th century. Oceanic survival theories offer another possible explanation for post-flood Nephilim populations. If the giants possessed advanced technology, they might have constructed underwater bases or submarine vessels that could survive global flooding. Ancient texts from various cultures describe encounters with giant beings who emerged from the sea or from underwater cities. The biblical account of Leviathan and other sea monsters might preserve memories of encounters with technologically advanced giants who had adapted to oceanic environments. These beings are consistently described as possessing capabilities that exceed normal biological parameters, exactly what we might expect from genetically enhanced populations with access to advanced technology. Modern cryptozoology reports include numerous encounters with giant humanoid beings that suggest such populations might still exist in remote locations. The global consistency of Bigfoot Yeti and similar creature reports is remarkable for beings that are supposed to be purely mythological. These entities are consistently described as being 7 to 10 feet tall, possessing human-like intelligence, and displaying behaviors that suggest organized social structures. More intriguingly, these creatures are often associated with areas that have histories of ancient giant activity. The Pacific Northwest, where Bigfoot sightings are most common, is also the region where some of the most compelling archaeological evidence of giant races has been discovered. The Himalayas, home to Yeti legends, contain cave systems and underground complexes that could conceivably house hidden populations. The pattern of institutional suppression surrounding both archaeological giant evidence and modern cryptozoological encounters suggests these phenomena might be more closely related than mainstream science acknowledges. Government agencies consistently dismiss or ridicule reports of giant creature encounters just as they suppress evidence of giant skeletal remains. This parallel treatment suggests both topics might threaten the same official narratives about human history and capabilities. Military encounters with anomalous giant entities have been reported from conflict zones around the world. Special operations forces in Afghanistan have described encounters with red-haired giants living in cave systems. These beings are reportedly hostile to human intrusion and possess capabilities that exceed normal human parameters. Official military reports of such encounters are typically classified or dismissed as misidentifications. The cooperation required to maintain suppression of giant evidence across multiple institutions and government agencies suggests that elite human populations may be aware of ongoing giant activity and consider it a classified matter requiring the highest levels of secrecy. This would explain why evidence is systematically removed from public access and why researchers who investigate these topics face consistent institutional opposition. Vatican-Smithsonian cooperation in maintaining official narratives becomes more understandable if both institutions recognize that giant populations still exist and pose potential threats to established power structures. If technologically advanced giants survived previous catastrophes and maintain hidden civilizations, they would represent the ultimate challenge to contemporary human authority systems. The genetic engineering capabilities that modern science is developing might represent attempts to recreate the enhanced characteristics that giants once possessed. If elite human populations have access to suppressed knowledge about giant genetics and technology, they might be working to incorporate these advantages into their own bloodlines, while preventing general populations from gaining similar capabilities. The end times prophecies found in biblical and apocryphal texts consistently describe the return of conditions similar to those that existed before the flood. Jesus specifically stated that, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. This could refer not only to moral corruption, but also to the reappearance of giant races and their forbidden technologies. Recent advances in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and aerospace technology are bringing humanity closer to capabilities that parallel those attributed to the pre-flood watchers. We are developing the ability to manipulate genetics, create hybrid beings, and travel between worlds. These achievements might represent humanity's rediscovery of knowledge that was once considered so dangerous that it required divine intervention to control. Matthew 24:37 says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be." Are we seeing the return? The convergence of suppressed archaeological evidence, modern technological capabilities, and biblical prophecy suggests we may be approaching a period when hidden truths about giant races and their relationship to human history can no longer be concealed. The institutional conspiracy to suppress giant evidence begins to make sense if we understand that it's not simply about hiding the past, but about controlling information that could fundamentally alter contemporary power relationships. If giant races survived previous catastrophes and continue to influence human affairs from hidden locations, then public awareness of their existence would transform every assumption about political authority, religious doctrine, and scientific knowledge. The evidence suggests that we are not dealing with an ancient mystery that has no contemporary relevance, but rather with an ongoing situation that continues to shape current events in ways that most people never suspect. The giants may not have disappeared, they may have simply learned to remain hidden while continuing to exercise influence over human civilization through carefully maintained secrecy and institutional control. If this assessment is accurate, then the current suppression of giant evidence represents more than simple academic bias or religious prejudice. It represents a coordinated effort to prevent general populations from understanding the true nature of the forces that continue to shape their world. The question is not whether giants once existed, but whether they still exist, and what their continued presence means for the future of human civilization. The evidence we've examined tonight forms a pattern so consistent and comprehensive that it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence, misidentification, or deliberate fraud. Over 1,000 documented discoveries of giant skeletal remains across North America. Ancient texts from cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries, all describing encounters with technologically advanced giant races. Vatican suppression of biblical texts that provide detailed accounts of these beings. Smithsonian acquisition and subsequent disappearance of physical evidence. Modern genetic anomalies that suggest artificial modification of human DNA. Underground cities and megalithic structures that display engineering capabilities far beyond officially recognized prehistoric achievements. Each piece of evidence might be individually challenged or explained away, but the cumulative weight of the pattern reveals something far more significant. A coordinated, centuries-long campaign to prevent humanity from understanding the true nature of our species' history and the forces that continue to shape our world. The timeline of suppression begins in 494 CE, when Pope Gelasius III banned the Book of Enoch and other texts that provided detailed accounts of the Nephilim. For over 16 centuries, the Vatican has systematically collected and hidden any evidence that might validate the literal existence of biblical giants. This religious suppression created the foundation for later academic and governmental efforts to maintain the same deception. The establishment of the Smithsonian Institution in 1846 provided the perfect mechanism for extending this suppression to the New World. Through their Bureau of Ethnology, the Smithsonian actively solicited and acquired anomalous skeletal remains from across North America. The 1895 California giant case perfectly illustrates their methodology. Acquire expensive specimens, study them privately. Then, after sufficient time has passed, declare them fraudulent and remove them from public access. This pattern has been repeated thousands of times over the past 175 years. Local museums and amateur archaeologists are encouraged to send unusual discoveries to Washington for expert analysis. The specimens disappear into restricted storage facilities. Official reports later dismiss the materials as hoaxes or misidentifications. Physical evidence becomes inaccessible to independent researchers. The coordination required for such systematic suppression demonstrates that we are not dealing with isolated institutional biases, but rather with a deliberate policy implemented across multiple organizations and government agencies. Academic journals refuse to publish research that challenges official narratives. Universities deny funding for projects that might validate giant evidence. Government agencies classify information about anomalous discoveries. Museum collections are purged of controversial materials. This level of coordination suggests that elite populations within these institutions understand the true implications of giant evidence and recognize that public awareness would fundamentally challenge established power structures. If technologically advanced giant races once ruled over normal human populations, and if they might still exist in hidden locations, then every assumption about political authority, religious doctrine, and scientific knowledge becomes subject to question. The modern implications extend far beyond academic debates about prehistoric archaeology. We are currently developing genetic engineering capabilities that parallel those attributed to the ancient Watchers. We are creating artificial intelligence systems that could replicate the forbidden knowledge that led to humanity's corruption before the flood. we are developing aerospace technologies that might allow the kind of interstellar travel described in the Book of Giants. If the biblical and apocryphal accounts are historically accurate rather than merely mythological, then we may be recreating the conditions that necessitated divine intervention in the past. The end times prophecies consistently describe the return of days of Noah conditions, which might refer not only to moral corruption, but also to the reappearance of hybrid beings and forbidden technologies. The genetic anomalies evident in Rh-negative populations suggest that Nephilim bloodlines may have survived into the modern era. If these genetic factors can be identified and understood, they might provide the key to unlocking the enhanced capabilities that giants once possessed. Elite populations with access to suppressed knowledge about giant genetics might already be working to incorporate these advantages into their own lineages. The underground cities and hidden facilities discovered around the world could serve as refuges for surviving giant populations or for elite human groups who have preserved ancient knowledge. These locations would provide the perfect environment for developing advanced technologies away from public scrutiny. They would also explain how suppressed knowledge could be maintained and transmitted across generations without public awareness. The pattern of institutional suppression surrounding both archaeological giant evidence and modern encounters with anomalous entities suggests these phenomena are more closely related than mainstream authorities acknowledge. If giant populations survived previous catastrophes and maintain hidden civilizations, they would possess both the motivation and capability to influence contemporary institutions from behind the scenes. The Vatican's astronomical research and statements about extraterrestrial life take on new significance when viewed in this context. If the Church recognizes that watchers might return or that giant populations might reemerge, they would need to prepare theological explanations that could maintain institutional authority while acknowledging realities that have been suppressed for centuries. The Smithsonian's continued denial that they possess any giant skeletal remains becomes increasingly implausible, given the extensive documentation of such materials being sent to their facilities. Their use of NAGPRA legislation to claim that controversial specimens have been repatriated provides convenient cover for materials that might reveal disturbing truths about human prehistory. The coordination between religious, academic, and governmental institutions in maintaining these deceptions suggests that elite populations within each organization understand they are protecting more than simple historical narratives. They are maintaining a version of reality that allows current power structures to continue functioning without challenge from forces that might possess superior knowledge and capabilities. But the suppression campaign is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in the information age. Digital documentation allows independent researchers to preserve evidence that would once have been easily destroyed or hidden. Global communication networks enable rapid sharing of information that would once have been contained within local communities. Alternative media platforms provide outlets for researchers who are denied access to mainstream academic journals. The Internet has also preserved thousands of historical newspaper accounts that document giant discoveries from the 19th and early 20th centuries. These reports provide detailed descriptions of skeletal remains that were later acquired by the Smithsonian and removed from public access. The consistency and specificity of these accounts makes it increasingly difficult to dismiss them as simple mistakes or deliberate hoaxes. Modern genetic research is revealing anomalies that align with ancient descriptions of hybrid beings. DNA analysis of elongated skulls and other anomalous remains is yielding results that challenge fundamental assumptions about human evolution and migration patterns. While mainstream journals refuse to publish these findings, alternative research networks are documenting and sharing the results. Archaeological discoveries continue to surface, despite institutional efforts to suppress them. Construction projects and natural disasters regularly expose burial sites containing oversized skeletal remains. While authorities quickly remove these materials from public access, witnesses are increasingly documenting discoveries through social media and independent research networks. The pattern of evidence suggests that we are approaching a threshold where suppressed truths about human history can no longer be concealed through traditional institutional control mechanisms. Too much evidence has been documented. Too many people have become aware of the patterns of suppression. Too many independent researchers are investigating these topics despite official discouragement. Your mission as truth seekers is to accelerate this process of disclosure by continuing to document, preserve, and share evidence that challenges official narratives. Every photograph of anomalous skeletal remains, every historical newspaper account of giant discoveries, every testimony from witnesses who have encountered institutional suppression adds to the weight of evidence that will eventually become impossible to ignore. The key is to maintain scientific rigor while investigating these topics. Document everything with meticulous care. Verify sources and cross-reference accounts. Preserve evidence in multiple formats and locations. Build networks of researchers who can share information and provide mutual support when facing institutional pressure. Understand that you are part of a larger movement to reclaim humanity's true history from those who have hidden it for their own purposes. The suppression of giant evidence is just one example of how elite institutions manipulate information to maintain power structures that depend on public ignorance. The stakes are enormous. If giant races really existed and possessed advanced technology, their knowledge could revolutionize human civilization. If they still exist in hidden locations, contact with them could transform every aspect of our world. If their genetics can be understood and applied, it could lead to enhanced human capabilities that we can barely imagine. But these possibilities can only be realized if we first break through the wall of deception that has hidden this knowledge for centuries. That requires courage, persistence, and above all, a commitment to truth that transcends institutional authority and official narratives. The evidence is there. The pattern is clear. The truth is waiting to be rediscovered. The only question is whether enough people will have the courage to seek it, despite the opposition they will face from those who profit from maintaining humanity's ignorance about its own extraordinary past and unlimited potential future. The time for passive acceptance of official explanations is over. The time for active investigation and discovery has begun. The giants may have been hidden, but they cannot remain hidden forever. The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep it has been buried. Our investigation has revealed the shocking truth about one of history's most successful cover-ups. We've seen documented evidence of over 1,000 giant skeletons discovered across North America, only to disappear into institutional storage facilities. We've examined how the Vatican has suppressed knowledge of the Nephilim for over 600 years, systematically removing texts and evidence that support their literal existence. We've traced the Smithsonian's pattern of acquiring expensive specimens only to later declare them fraudulent after removing them from public access. We've explored ancient texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants that provide detailed first-person accounts of technologically advanced beings who possessed knowledge that our civilization is only beginning to rediscover. We've seen how Native American oral traditions, global flood narratives, and megalithic architecture all point to the historical reality of giant races that once dominated human civilization. Most disturbing of all, we've uncovered evidence suggesting that these beings may not have disappeared, but rather retreated to hidden locations where they continue to influence human affairs while remaining concealed from general public awareness. But questions remain. Where are the thousands of giant skeletal remains that were documented as being sent to the Smithsonian? Why do Vatican astronomical facilities spend so much time scanning the skies if they're only interested in conventional scientific research? What happens to the giant skeletal remains that continue to be discovered during modern construction projects? Why do government agencies consistently suppress or ridicule encounters with anomalous giant entities? Most importantly, if Jesus said that the end times would be as it was in the days of Noah, and if those days were characterized by the presence of giant hybrid beings with forbidden technology, what does that mean for our current era when we're developing the same genetic engineering and aerospace capabilities that the ancient watchers once possessed? Your mission, fellow truth seekers, is to keep asking these hard questions and demanding answers from institutions that would prefer to maintain their wall of secrecy. Don't accept official explanations simply because they come from authorities. Document everything you discover. Share information with other researchers. Build networks that can preserve and protect evidence that might otherwise disappear into institutional black holes. The tools for investigation have never been more powerful. Digital cameras can document discoveries before they disappear. Internet archives can preserve historical records that might otherwise be destroyed. Global communication networks allow researchers to coordinate efforts and share findings across vast distances. Genetic analysis equipment is becoming increasingly accessible to independent investigators. Use these tools. Become part of the solution. Every piece of evidence you preserve, every connection you make, every person you wake up to, these suppressed truths brings us closer to the day when humanity will finally reclaim its stolen history. If this investigation has opened your eyes to the hidden layers of our past, subscribe now for more forbidden truths that mainstream institutions don't want you to discover. Share this documentary before it gets suppressed. Download and preserve the evidence we've presented. And let me know in the comments what discoveries you've made in your own research. Your findings might be the key that unlocks the next piece of this massive puzzle. Next week, we're diving even deeper into the rabbit hole with an investigation that will shock you to your core. We'll be examining the alleged UFO crash retrievals that government insiders claim contain beings with 6 fingers, double rows of teeth, and genetic markers that match ancient descriptions of the Nephilim. Are modern extraterrestrial encounters actually meetings with the returning watchers? Are underground military bases housing captured giants while reverse engineering their technology? The evidence will change everything you thought you knew about both ancient history and contemporary reality. But that's not all. We've obtained classified documents that suggest certain bloodlines have maintained genetic connections to the Nephilim through thousands of years of careful breeding programs. These families allegedly possess enhanced capabilities and advanced knowledge that they've used to maintain control over human civilization while keeping their true nature hidden from public awareness. We'll also be investigating the growing number of reports from military personnel who claim to have encountered giant entities during operations in remote locations around the world. These beings are described as hostile to human intrusion and possessing technology that exceeds anything in conventional military arsenals. Are these encounters with surviving populations of the original Nephilim, or are they evidence of something even more disturbing? Most importantly, we'll be examining the evidence that suggests we are rapidly approaching the prophesied return of conditions that existed in the days of Noah. Genetic engineering breakthroughs, artificial intelligence development, and space exploration programs are bringing us closer to capabilities that ancient texts describe as leading to the corruption of all flesh. Are we repeating the same mistakes that led to divine judgment in the past? Until then, keep seeking the truth. Question everything. Document everything. Share everything. They can hide the evidence, but they can't hide it forever. The giants are awakening, the watchers are returning, and humanity's stolen heritage is finally being reclaimed by those brave enough to look beyond the lies that have blinded us for centuries. The search continues. The truth cannot be stopped, and neither can you.